Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover the Prophets, using a translation and commentary by Robert Alter. This is one of three parts of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and this is book 2 for my 2024 reading list. Well, I've made a plan to start each year by just reading straight through the Bible. I choose a different translation, a different version. It's just something I want to do, and as I'm going through the great books, I just want to start each year off reading through the Bible, and then I like actually seeing if there are references to the Bible, or if the Bible is impacted by some of the earlier great books. I'm curious on that end, and so that's why I've made it a part of this project to start each year with the Bible. So the version I'm using this year of the Old Testament is the one by Robert Alter, where he not only does the translation, but also has a commentary within there. So on most pages of this version, the footnotes at the bottom that make up the commentary are actually larger on the page than the actual text. And so I am not reading all of the commentary. I am reading the entire Bible, but I'm not reading all of Robert Alter's commentary. But what I am doing is referencing it where I have questions, or I'm just kind of curious about something that is written, or just not understanding it. I'll glance at those at the commentary. I did read the entire commentary for the book of Genesis and realized that there was no way I'd be able to get through the Bible in 2 months if I read all of the commentary. So I may kind of go back to different books in the future in different years and kind of dig in deep to each of the books with Robert Alter's commentary, because it is tremendously helpful. I've learned a lot from it. But at this point, I'm just kind of referencing it as I read through the Bible. So the Prophets, this is the second part of it. In the Prophets, I'll go through what books are contained in the Prophets. But this is the largest of the 4 books that I'm reading of the Bible. So 3 are part of the Hebrew Bible, and then the 4th book will be the New Testament. So the way it's split up for the Hebrew Bible with this Robert Alter translation is the Torah is first, and that's the first 5 books of the Bible, and that's what I covered in the previous episode. And then the second one here is the Prophets, and then the third one is called the Writings, and the Writings consist of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Esther, Nehemiah, Ezra, a bunch of different books, and then closes out with Chronicles. So the Prophets here are the books that are part of the Prophets. Starts off with Joshua and then goes into Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then into the 12 minor prophets, who are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, this is a huge book. It's one of the biggest books I've read for this project. The Prophets part was 1,404 pages. So it was large, but again, most of the page is taken up with the commentary, and that's in very small font, and then the rest of the Bible. So it took me 37 hours and 42 minutes to get through this book of the Prophets. I did that over 20 days, and I averaged 70 pages per day. And that was between January 22nd and February 10. Again, it's a 1,404 page book. And so in the last episode, I covered the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And in those books, we saw creation, we saw God calling Abraham, and then we saw this them being taken to Egypt, and then all of a sudden they're in slavery in Egypt. There's the exodus out of Egypt through Moses, and then they get to the edge of the promised land. And so to Abraham, God had promised this land. And now at the end of the Torah, they're right on the verge of entering this promised land. And the Israelites are made up of 12 tribes. And so they're right on the edge here, but Moses cannot take them into the promised land. He screws up, and so that falls upon Joshua to take them into the promised land. So that's where we pick up here in the prophets. First book is Joshua, and so Joshua is taking them into the promised land, and so that's where Joshua starts. And so basically it starts not in the land, and then they get into the land. In the book of Judges, just do kind of a quick overview of the prophets here. In Judges, that's kind of the initial leadership of the people of Israel when they are in the land. So they don't have kings right away. They're these judges. And then we get into the book of Samuel, and that is the shift into kingship. So Saul is the first king, and then we get into King David. We have the stories of like David and Goliath, David and Bathsheba, and really the consolidation of power into one people made up of these 12 tribes. So that's really the book of Samuel. The beginning of the book of Kings is where the kingship transfers from David to his son Solomon. And there's kind of this Godfather scene at the beginning where David's saying, you got to take this guy out. He did this in the past. And Solomon does that and consolidates power. There was, kind of talk of split, but it remains all together. But after Solomon, the kingdom splits into two. You've got Israel in the north and then Judah in the south. And then the rest of the book of Kings is just describing the two kings or the two areas, Israel and Judah, and the kings that were part of them. And so it's just a book of like, then this person was king, and then this person was king, and then there is a moral judgment on each of the kings of whether they were a good or a bad king. And in Israel, all of the kings were bad. There was not a single good king in Israel. And Judah kind of had a mixed bag, so some of the kings were good, some of the kings were bad. Towards the end of Kings, we start to see that the two kingdoms are going to be exiled, and Israel is in fact exiled, and they are exiled to Assyria. So the Assyrians come in, they attack them, and then they scatter them and assimilate them into different areas. So at that point, Israel ceases to exist, the kingdom of Israel in the north, and the people are scattered into different lands. The Assyrians did this. This was kind of the way they operated. And then not only that, but the Assyrians brought in other people into that land. So kingdom of Israel is gone by that point. A little later on, the kingdom of Judah is exiled as well. The Babylonians come in, attack them, and exile them to Babylon. A few of the people of Judah go to Egypt, but most of them go into Babylon. The people of Israel never return to Israel, the kingdom of Israel. They're scattered. It's gone. The people of Judah, some of them do return, but they don't return to Israel. They return to Judah and the area, Jerusalem and surrounding area. But they return to Judah, not Israel. So then we enter the major and the minor prophets, and they're kind of broken up into two different groups. So you've got some of the prophets who are either prophets to Judah or prophets to Israel, to the different kingdoms, and then the second major group is prophets that are either before, during, or after exile. So each of the prophets kind of fits within that graph at somewhere, whether it's to the people of Judah or Israel, and then whether it's before, during, or after exile. So at the end of the prophets here, you've got these lists of promises of a return to the land. You've got these different, if you do this, then this will happen. And some of them are fulfilled. Some of them are in the process of being fulfilled, but there's a lot that's not fulfilled. And so at the end of the prophets, you're just kind of wondering, what happens next. The prophets are telling what is going to happen. They've also told what will happen if you don't do such and such. So kind of before, whether they're before or after the exile. So yeah, there's this tension at the end of the prophets of what's going to happen next. And so I think the writings will get into some of that, but then some of these questions are just kind of left hanging there at the end as well. As for initial reaction to reading the prophets, every time I read them, I pick up more. I mean, that would seem like probably the most obvious thing I could say, but it's also just like I'm looking for different things every time. And part of that I covered in the last episode, where just by starting reading in Genesis, something usually pops up and I'm like, I either never noticed that before, or that's really interesting, or I've read other things that kind of help me pinpoint that or think about that. And so I'll cover some of those things in the next segment, which is a segment of observations from the prophets. But yeah, that's kind of my main initial reaction is just it's fun to read, to do this every year, to read through the Bible and just see what I gravitate towards, see what I pick up, see what sticks out to me. So next segment will be those observations, and then the final segment will be the one thing, my one key takeaway. It's kind of a weird thing to say about the Bible, but just like the one thing I'm still thinking about, or that I guess shocked me the most when reading it this time. Want to make a quick note here. One of the actual last book I read in 2023 was Paul and the Resurrection of Israel by Dr. Jason A. Staples. And I saw that someone else read that book recently, and they made the statement that there's no going back. You've changed things forever. And that's really how I feel about that book as well. He talks a lot about the distinction between the people of Judah, the people of Israel, and the terms, and how those terms were used in these ancient texts, how they were used in texts around this time as well, especially in the Second Temple period. And it truly is. It's one of those books where there's no going back. You've changed things forever. It's changed how I've looked at these terms, how I've looked at the books of the Bible, and how I read them. And so even in this segment of observations, just having read that book as the final book of 2023, right before I started into the Bible, it's kind of fresh, and it's how I'm looking at things and questioning things and wondering, why was this term used here? Why was it not this term? And this term doesn't seem to make sense here. Why is this term being used? So it's fun. Like it's causing me to read at a deeper level, to ask deeper questions. And so I hope some of that comes about in this episode, but I do suggest you check out that book. I'll link to the show notes to the episode that I did about that book. And then also link to where you can purchase that book. But that's been very helpful just in reading through the prophets, especially Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then also just to consider what is happening and why. So I wanted to plug that book again. So here are 7 observations as I read through the prophets. The first, and this really comes from the version I'm reading and the Robert Alter translation and commentary, is just the difference between poetry and prose. This is something I never noticed before, but it's something that Robert Alter points out repeatedly. So he'll say, such and such wrote this book in poetry. And then the formatting of the translation that Robert Alter does, it shows up in poetry to where it's smaller or larger margins and just gives that feel. Whereas prose, he said, this is where this author is using prose, and so poetry will often have an elevated sense, like it's elevated language. It kind of gives importance to that. Whereas prose might be more of a descriptive text of what's actually happening in this scene. So in the books of like the history, where Kings and Samuel, that's going to be more prose, where you'll have points of poetry in there where perhaps someone is speaking or that kind of a thing, or there's a song or something like that. I'm in book 3 right now of the Hebrew Bible, and I'm currently reading Job. And what's really interesting in Job is that the first 2 chapters are in prose, the very last chapter is in prose, but then everything in between is poetry. So it just has me asking this question as I come to every book here of what's the use case for each, where you would use prose in one case, but you'd use poetry in another. The poetry, using poetry, there's a lot of instances where the purpose of that is for memory, to help you remember it easier. Maybe there's kind of a meter to it. Poetry in our sense, in at least in the United States, often has the connotation that it will rhyme. But again, the rhyme is there, and it helps you to remember the poem. A lot of what is in the Hebrew Bible is going to be kind of a parallel, to where they'll make one statement and then the next statement will be an exaggeration or an enhancement of the first statement. So not necessarily rhyming, but but that kind of parallelism. But poetry just has this elevated language aspect to it. And so I just find myself, especially as Robert Alter is highlighting each case, to just focus on that. And it's something I've never done before. And so it's just kind of really neat to make that observation and distinction. So that's the first thing on this list here. The second is the land, and this is something I covered in the last episode. What's the deal with the land? The land is promised to Abraham, the land of Israel, the land flowing with milk and honey. But they lose the land. The kingdom of Israel, they're scattered. They're gone. So the land of Israel is no more. But the promise is still there. So what's the deal with that? And this kind of gets into my third thing of just the word forever. There are a lot of promises, and a lot of the promises carry the connotation that they will be a promise forever, whether the sons of David will rule forever, or you'll be in the land forever. There's this promise. And so, but a lot of the things don't last forever. So what's the deal with these promises? Like, why does it say it's forever, but it's not forever, and it goes away? So I think there's kind of two options here. Since some of these promises were based upon a covenant, there's this aspect that there's two parties to that covenant, and they both need to keep their part of it. So if God keeps his part of the covenant, but the people don't, then the covenant is null and void, and there's a penalty for breaking that covenant and all that. So that's one possibility, is that these forever promises don't exist anymore because they're null and void. So that's one option. But the other option is that the promises is still there. It's still meant to occur, but it's meant to occur in the future. And so, again, just another observation. I every time I'm coming across the word forever, or there being a promise that is supposed to be forever, I'm kind of making note of it and writing it in the back of the Bible, and just, what does this mean? Because the land was promised forever. They're not in the land. What's the deal? The fourth thing is, to this day, this term shows up over and over, and it's something I pointed out in the first episode about the Torah, but just this distinction of when the events happened compared to when they were written about. And so a lot of these books were compiled during the Babylonian exile. And what does that mean? Were they pulling from earlier texts and just kind of, copying them down, or were they being composed at that time? Were they being written? And so these are just kind of questions I've had during the reading this time. And I'll get into this more in my one thing. This will tie in really closely, but just, again, an observation, and just to kind of take a step back. When I mean observation, it's kind of like I keep writing these things down in my notes in the Bible. So these are the things that showed up over and over again, and that stuck out to me. I noticed, and oftentimes for the first time. So this in going through the Bible, this was the first time that these things really stuck out to me. Every time I'm coming across them now, I'm making notes of them and that sort of thing. All right, the next thing, number 5 here, is it kind of points back to the way I started this segment in Dr. Jason Staples' book. The terms all Israel and all Judah. So all Judah, that term is not used very much at all. But I'm very fascinated when the term all Israel is used, because it is used quite often, but it's used in the prophets, and it's used after Israel doesn't exist. So what does it mean to say all Israel when 10 of the tribes are scattered and they don't live in the land anymore? What does that mean? Did Judah take their name? And so, like, once Israel's gone, Judah then becomes Israel, and so we just start calling Judah Israel. Is that what happened? Or does all Israel point to a time in the future where all of the 12 tribes will reunite? And if that's the case, how is that going to work? Because they've been scattered. They're not, you can't, get them back. They're not coming back. And especially now, 2,500 years later, what does all Israel mean at this point in time? So again, just kind of, noticing that and wondering, why is the author, why is the prophet, why is this book? Why is it referring to all Israel here, especially after the exile where Israel does not exist? Number 6, I noticed the importance of the founders of the two kingdoms. So you've got the kingdom of David, and that's pretty much consolidated, and then still mostly consolidated during Solomon, but then Solomon dies and the kingdom splits, and you've got Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And Jeroboam is the king of Israel, and then Rehoboam is the king of Judah. And as I said before, all the kings of Israel were labeled bad, and there was kind of a mixed bag in Israel. So Jeroboam was a bad king, and Rehoboam was a good king. And throughout the rest of the book of Kings, you get these terms that such and such king, the later kings of Israel, such and such king reigned like in the mode of Jeroboam and continued to do the bad things. And then Rehoboam starts off the kingdom of Judah in perhaps the right direction. But it was just interesting to me how important the founders of those two kingdoms were, or the first leaders were, in the subsequent leadership. And the direction that was set at the very beginning, how that played out throughout the rest of the history of those two kingdoms. And it's like the people of Israel could never get past that initial bad start by Jeroboam. And it was a really bad start. You can read about it. But they never got past that, whereas Rehoboam in the kingdom of Judah, it was a mixed bag of good and bad leaders. But with Jeroboam being the bad leader, they couldn't shift direction from there. And I just found that to be very fascinating, just the importance of the initial leadership. Last thing here of observations is number 7. Robert Alter keeps highlighting this he calls it the utopian hope for national restoration. And this is, again, where the exiles are going to return, and they're going to return to the land. And I kind of got this sense that Alter was highlighting it as kind of like, absurd's not the right word, but just like, okay, this is kind of quaint and neat how the prophets they've got this utopian hope that the people are going to come back, but they're scattered, like they're not coming back. But you see this writing, and you see this hope keep coming back. And so it's just kind of interesting. Alter keeps calling it a utopian hope in that sense of just, that this is not going to happen. But going back to Dr. Jason Staples' book, he talks about how that will happen and how it's expected to happen. And so I just think that's interesting. Again, it's observation. A lot of the times when you're coming across the restoration language, you look down at the footnotes, and Robert Alter calls it the utopian hope for national restoration. So these are the 7 things that really stuck out to me while reading through the prophets this time. All right, now on to the one thing that really stuck out to me in this reading. And what's funny is I highlighted it in the episode I did about the Torah. And I said I had this question that I hadn't pondered before. And the thing is, I'm not going to get the answer of it in the Bible, because this is one that is dealing more with scholarship. So I'm going to have a scholar on the episode and ask him or her this question. And so that's kind of how I left it in the last episode. But the question actually got answered in the prophets here. And it got answered in the footnotes by Robert Alter. So Alter highlighted it. I wasn't expecting this, but I do want to highlight it because I didn't think I'd get it answered until I talked to a scholar about it. But here's kind of the genesis of this question. The question deals with the timing of writing, and I mentioned this in the last segment here of just the phrase kept coming up, to this day. And so they're writing about it in this thing happened then, but you can still see the ramifications, or you can see this pile of stones that was put up at when this thing happened. You can still see this to this day, or this people group is still here to this day. So when this is being compiled, as opposed to when it actually occurred. And so it just kind of led to these questions of, was it it compiled or was it written at that time? Because depending on that, it changes how you read it. Like, were the people at the time when these things were happening, were these the expectations they had, or were the expectations being written about later from a different people group? And so that's kind of the genesis of the question, just where I'm kind of battling that as I'm reading along, because a lot of this stuff was compiled during the Babylonian exile, but the things being written about may have been 500 or more years before. So just what's the timing in all this? What did they actually have? Like what version were they reading back when it actually happened, or as it was being done compared to when it was compiled, that kind of thing. And so the answer came up in 2 Kings in chapter 22. And this is where King Josiah, who is a king of Judah, he's one of the good kings. He comes across a book. And so let me just read this. And Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan the scribe, "I have found a book of teaching in the house of the Lord." And later on, the priest gave me a book, and Shaphan read it to the king. It had happened when the king heard the words of the book of teaching that he rent his garments. And the king charged Hilkiah, the priest, and the scribes, and said, "Go inquire of the Lord on my behalf and on behalf of the people and on behalf of all Judah concerning the words of this book that have been found. For great is the Lord's wrath that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not heeded the words of this book to do as all that is written in it." So that's I'm going to end the quote there. That's from 2 Kings. And then now I'm going to start reading from the footnote of Robert Alter. And so here we go. For 2 centuries, the scholarly consensus, despite some dissent, has been that the found book is Deuteronomy. So let me pull myself out of the quote here for a second. King Josiah, they had found this book, and then King Josiah says, "Let's please read it." And then that causes a bunch of changes and all that. And so Robert Alter is saying here that the scholarly consensus is that was the book of Deuteronomy. So let me go back into what Robert Alter was saying here. Although attributed to Moses, it would have been written in the reign of Josiah, perhaps drawing on some earlier materials. The book found in 621 BCE was altogether not identical with Deuteronomy as we have it, which almost certainly included some later elements and was not edited in the form that has come down to us until the Babylonian exile. The major new emphasis of the book brought to Josiah were the repeated stress on the exclusivity of the cult in Jerusalem, the place that I shall choose, and dire warnings of imminent disaster and exile if the people failed to fulfill its covenant with God. End quote. And so that it doesn't fully answer the question, but it at least addressed it, and I thought it was interesting. And so just on some different levels here, you've got when the book was written, and Alter saying that there was a version, and they were taking part of that, but there were some additions to it as well. So that answered that part of the question. But just also of asking that question of, was it identical with what we have, the Deuteronomy that we have now, or were the warnings added later to kind of show like, hey, now that we're in exile, we realize that you should have been heeding these warnings. And so it gets into it a little bit there. I still will address this with scholars, but I was just happy to see that it was addressed at all, and just kind of helped in that understanding that here Josiah comes across this book. It's probably what we now know of as Deuteronomy. It's not exactly the same. Here are some potential differences to it. I just found that to be really, really fascinating, and that's kind of my one big thing from this book, from the prophets. So to recap, these are really exciting books. If you've never read through the Bible before, Samuel and Kings are just they're amazing books. I mean, the story you'll be in rapture just reading these books. The prophets, they can get a little weird. Isaiah for me is always challenging. Jeremiah, I always really enjoy. And then Ezekiel is kind of a mixed bag of I enjoy it, I like it, and then it's also got some weird parts as well. But just these are really exciting books. If you get a chance, read the Robert Alter translation and commentaries. He's actually sells a lot of these books just in their individual form. So you can get just Samuel, and it's called The David Story. You can just buy that book, and it contains 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then the first 2 chapters of Kings, because that's kind of a full narrative together there. You can just get the Psalms, you can just get Genesis, you can just get the Torah. So there's different ways you can approach this. The version I got is the entire Hebrew Bible, and it's split into the 3 books. But I found it to be very helpful. Robert Alter will highlight different words and say, this word was used here in this book of the Bible. That's why I translated it this way. So just kind of seeing like one person talking about how they translated and the decisions that went into that is really fascinating, and I've learned a lot. The other thing I really appreciate about the Robert Alter commentary is that he highlights a lot of the ancient Near East ideas and other books and how those may have influenced the Bible, or how the Bible may have influenced those. And just with my Great Books project here of reading some of these ancient texts, especially last year in 2023, I've found that to be very fascinating. So just in terms of timing, this is kind of perfect timing for me to get into the Robert Alter translation and commentary. There will be 2 more books. So the one I'm reading right now is the Writings, and that's the final book of the Old Testament. And then I will read a different translation of the New Testament. Robert Alter has not done a translation of the New Testament, so I'll do a different one of that. And I will highlight those in the podcast coming up. Give a quick plug for EPR Creations. That is my company. I do website development and online consulting. And so Books of Titans is a side project for me. I fund it all through EPR Creations. So if you want to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is to let me know if you know of someone who needs a website, if you know of a company that needs a website. I work with universities and small businesses and health organizations on their online presence. So if you know of someone who is in need of a website, search engine optimization, online presence consulting, please keep me in mind. That's the work that funds this reading project. I don't do basic websites, so most of what I do is complex websites, big websites. So don't send me kind of like the basic, I need a 1-page website or something like that, but more of companies or organizations that who need an overhaul in their web presence. And I thrive in those circumstances. I do want to highlight one other thing. I'm the business manager at Landmark Booksellers, and we've just announced a number of subscriptions. So book subscriptions where you get 1 book a month. And I'll link to all of those that we have, but there's one in particular that's called the Books of Titans book subscription. And so I have curated a list of 12 books, and here's how it works. At the beginning of each month, you'll get an email, and it will say, here is this month's pick. If you've already read that option, if you have already read that book, you'll see 2 other alternatives in the email, and so you can select one of those if you'd rather have that. But this is a list of books that I've read for this project, and that I think are the best ones I've read. They're probably the ones that are most likely to change your life or change your thinking. And so if you don't want to put in the time to research what to read next, let this be your guide. Let the list of books that I've curated, let us send you those one a month. It's $39 a month, and that gets you a hardcover version of one of these books. That'll do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you if you have read, especially if you've read the Robert Alter translation and commentary of the Bible, or just in general, if you've read the prophets and I missed something, or there's something you want to share, I would love to hear that. One of the reasons I started this reading project was to connect with other people who are reading the same books as me. I will include a lot of info in the show notes in terms of the links, one to Dr. Jason Staples' book that I mentioned, also to EPR Creations, and then another one to the Books of Titans subscription, the book subscription that you can sign up for. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and the website is stock full of resources to help you find books and to create your own reading list. So I'll be back in a week or two. I'll discuss the Writings, the next book of the Hebrew Bible, and then the New Testament. And I also have some ideas for some other episodes that I want to do that are One would just be to have someone on to discuss the differences between poetry and prose. And then I also want to have Dr. Jason Staples on, where I can ask him some questions about the Bible that have come up in my reading, and then also to discuss that new book that I mentioned that he just wrote. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.